The iron-grey waves of the Caribbean Sea rose and fell beneath the hull of the Serpent's Oath as Captain Jeremiah Ashe stood at the quarterdeck, one hand gripping the weathered rail, the other resting upon the pommel of his cutlass. The year was 1687, and the salt wind carried with it the scent of gunpowder and distant rain. Below deck, 16 men slept in their hammocks, their dreams haunted by the promise Ashe had made them 3 months prior in a torch-lit cavern on the windward side of Tortuga. A vow of brotherhood, sealed in blood and rum, that every man aboard would share equally in their plunder, that no soul would be left to drown or hang alone, that their fates were bound as tightly as the rigging that held their sails. But Captain Ashe knew what his men did not. Beneath 30 fathoms of Caribbean water, wrapped in canvas and weighted with chain, lay the truth he had sworn never to speak. If you sail these waters with us, drop your country or city in the comments and subscribe to hear more tales from the Golden Age. The morning the Serpent's Oath had departed Port Royal, the crew had numbered 17. Ashe remembered the face of Thomas Quill as clearly as he remembered his own reflection, a young sailor from Bristol with steady hands and eyes that never flinched when the cannons roared. Quill had been the first to sign the Articles of Brotherhood, the first to press his thumb into the wax beside Ashe's own mark. The crew had trusted Quill. They had trusted Ashe even more. But trust, like timber exposed to salt and sun, could rot from the inside while appearing whole on the surface. It had happened on a moonless night 6 weeks into their voyage, somewhere between the Windward Passage and the coast of Hispaniola. The Serpent's Oath had taken a Spanish merchantman earlier that day, and the hold now groaned with barrels of sugar, bolts of silk, and 3 iron-bound chests of silver reals. The crew had celebrated with stolen wine, their voices carrying across the black water as they sang songs of fortune and freedom. Ashe had retired to his cabin to examine the ship's manifest, a greasy document written in Castilian that listed cargo far exceeding what they had found. Someone had skimmed the cream before the Serpent's Oath arrived. Someone had known the route, the schedule, the exact location where the merchantman would pass. Ashe had suspected treachery for weeks. Small things at first, a missing sextant, a chart altered to show false depths, whispers that ceased when he approached. Then came the letter he discovered in Quill's sea chest, written in cipher but decoded easily enough by a man who had once run messages for Jamaican governors. The letter spoke of rendezvous points, of Spanish patrols that would conveniently look the other way, of a planned mutiny that would see Ashe hanging from his own yardarm, while Quill took command and delivered the Serpent's Oath into the service of the Spanish crown as a privateer operating under false English colours. The brotherhood Ashe had proclaimed was built upon sand. Quill had never intended to honour it. He had signed the articles to gain the crew's trust, to learn their routes and tactics, to position himself for betrayal. And so Captain Ashe had made his choice, one that would haunt him across every league of ocean he would ever sail. He had confronted Quill in the privacy of the forecastle, away from the ears of sleeping men. The conversation had been brief. Quill denied nothing. He smiled even, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt. But Ashe was faster, his blade finding the space between Quill's ribs before the younger man could draw breath to shout. The light had faded from those steady eyes, and Ashe had whispered an apology that no one would ever hear. Then came the harder work, wrapping the body in canvas, binding it with spare anchor chain, waiting for the watch to change before slipping the weighted corpse over the stern rail into water so deep no diver would ever find it. When dawn broke and the crew discovered Quill missing, Ashe had told them the lie that would become his cross to bear. Quill had fallen overboard during the night watch, he said, swept away by a rogue wave while securing a loose halyard. Some men wept, others cursed the sea. All of them believed their captain, because Captain Ash was a man of his word, a man who had vowed brotherhood, a man who would never raise his hand against his own crew. The irony burned in Ash's throat like cheap rum. The Serpent's Oath had continued south, following the trade winds toward the Spanish Main. They raided a Portuguese slaver off the coast of Trinidad, freeing 60 men and women who stared at their liberators with hollow eyes that understood freedom was just another form of uncertainty. Ash offered them positions aboard his ship, but most chose to disappear into the jungle interior, seeking communities of runaways where Spanish law could not reach. 3 stayed, a man named Kwame, who had been a sailor before his capture, and 2 others who said nothing, but proved themselves capable with rope and sail. The crew's share of the plunder had been divided according to the articles. Every man received his portion. Ash took no more than what was agreed, though he knew that Quill's absence meant 1 less share to split. The remaining silver bought them resupply at a hidden cove on the Venezuelan coast, where a one-eyed merchant named Beauchamp operated a trading post that asked no questions and kept no records. Beauchamp had known Ash for years, had seen him grow from a powder monkey on a Jamaican sloop to the master of his own vessel. Over rum in the back room of Beauchamp's warehouse, the merchant had asked about Quill. "Heard you lost a man," Beauchamp said, his good eye studying Ash's face with uncomfortable precision. "The sea takes what it wants," Ash replied. "Strange, though. Thomas Quill was a strong swimmer, won a coin purse once, diving for pearls off Grenada." Ash said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them like a rope drawn taut. Beauchamp shrugged and poured more rum, but his expression suggested he suspected more than he would say. In the world of pirates and privateers, loose tongues found themselves cut out. Beauchamp was a survivor because he understood when to speak and when to swallow his curiosity. The Serpent's Oath left Venezuelan waters and turned west, following the Spanish treasure routes toward Cartagena. It was dangerous water, patrolled by warships and corsairs who answered to no flag but profit. Ash's plan was to intercept a mule train carrying Peruvian gold from the interior to the coast, a scheme that required precise timing and intelligence gathered from contacts in port towns, where Spanish authority was weak and bribery was cheaper than bloodshed. But something had changed among the crew. Ash felt it in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the glances exchanged during the evening watch, in the quality of the silence that followed his orders. Kwame, the freed sailor who had joined them in Trinidad, seemed to attract these whispers. He was capable, fearless even, but he watched Ash with eyes that saw too much. One night, as the ship rode at anchor in a sheltered bay, Kwame approached the captain on the quarterdeck. "The men are troubled," Kwame said, his voice low and measured. "Why?" Ash asked, though he already suspected the answer. "They say Thomas Quill's ghost walks the deck at midnight. They say they hear him calling from the water." Ash's jaw tightened. "Sailors are superstitious fools." "Perhaps, but superstition and doubt are brothers. When men doubt their captain, they become dangerous." The truth of it settled over Ash like a shroud. He had killed Quill to protect the crew from betrayal, but in doing so, he had violated the very brotherhood he claimed to uphold. The lie he told was meant to preserve unity, but lies were seeds that sprouted thorns. If the crew ever learned what he had done, they would see him not as their protector, but as a murderer who could not be trusted. The articles they had signed meant nothing if the man who enforced them was willing to break them in secret. "What do you believe, Kwame?" Ash asked. The freed sailor looked out at the black water, where phosphorescent plankton glowed like drowned stars. "I believe every man carries secrets that would sink him if the weight became too great. I believe the sea remembers what we try to forget. And I believe Captain Ash is a man who understands the cost of command." It was the closest anyone had come to naming the truth. And yet Kwame had chosen his words carefully enough to deny nothing and accuse nothing. Ash nodded slowly. "Keep the men steady. We have work ahead." The planned raid on the mule train succeeded beyond expectation. Ash and 15 men ambushed the convoy at dawn as it wound through a mountain pass 3 leagues from Cartagena. The Spanish guards, surprised and outnumbered, surrendered after a brief exchange of musket fire that left 2 of them wounded, and the rest fleeing into the jungle. The mules carried chests of gold doubloons, sacks of emeralds from the mines of Muzo, and sealed bags of pearls harvested from the oyster beds of Margarita Island. It was a fortune that would make every man aboard the Serpent's Oath wealthy enough to retire if they lived long enough to spend it, but returning to the ship proved more treacherous than the raid itself. Spanish cavalry had been dispatched from Cartagena, and the pirates found themselves pursued through hostile territory, carrying plunder that grew heavier with every mile. They reached the coast exhausted and bloodied, loading their treasure into longboats, while musket balls kicked up sand around them. One man, a gunner named Fitch, took a ball through the shoulder and had to be dragged into the boat by his mates. As the Serpent's Oath raised anchor and slipped away into the fading light, Spanish warships appeared on the horizon, their sails like the wings of hunting birds. The chase lasted 3 days. Ash pushed his ship to her limits, running before the wind through narrow channels where the Spanish dared not follow, threading between reefs that would have gutted a larger vessel. By the time they reached open water, 2 of the pursuing ships had fallen behind, but a third, a sleek frigate flying the colors of the Spanish Navy, remained dogged in its pursuit. Her captain was either brave or foolish, or perhaps both, and he clearly intended to reclaim the stolen treasure or sink the Serpent's Oath trying. Ash called his crew to quarters and prepared for battle. The cannons were loaded with chain shot to tear the frigate's rigging, while marksmen climbed into the rigging with muskets and powder. The Spanish ship closed the distance, her bow chasers firing ranging shots that sent plumes of water skyward. Then, as the sun began to set, the frigate drew alongside and unleashed a broadside that shook the Serpent's Oath to her keel. Splinters flew like daggers. Men screamed. The acrid smoke of gunpowder filled the air, so thick it burned the lungs and blinded the eyes. Ash roared commands from the quarterdeck, his voice cutting through the chaos. The Serpent's Oath answered with her own guns, the deck leaping beneath their feet as 8 cannons spoke in thunder. The Spanish frigate shuddered, her mainmast cracking and toppling into the sea, dragging sails and men with it. For a moment, Ash thought they had won. Then he saw the grappling hooks flying across the gap between the ships, saw Spanish Marines preparing to board, their swords catching the dying light. The fighting that followed was brutal and close, cutlass against saber, pistol shot at arm's length, men grappling and bleeding on decks slick with gore. Ash found himself face to face with the Spanish captain, a grey-haired officer whose eyes blazed with righteous fury. They traded blows, steel ringing against steel, neither giving ground. The Spanish captain was skilled, but Ash was desperate, and desperation lent strength to tired muscles. He fainted low, then drove his blade upward, finding the gap beneath the Spaniard's breastplate. The officer fell without a word, his blood pooling on the deck. With their captain dead, the Spanish Marines faltered. Some surrendered, others leaped into the sea, choosing drowning over capture. The Serpent's Oath cut the grappling lines and limped away from the crippled frigate, leaving it wallowing in the swells. Ash counted his losses. 4 men dead, 7 wounded, and the ship herself holed above the waterline and taking on water through sprung planks. They would need repairs before they could reach safe harbor. Kwame approached Ash as the crew secured the prisoners and began tending to the wounded. "We cannot return to Port Royal with a Spanish frigate on our conscience and a king's ransom in stolen gold. The authorities will ask questions." "We'll make for Tortuga," Ash said. "Split the treasure there and scatter. Let every man find his own fate." But Kwame's expression suggested he knew, as Ash did, that scattering would not solve the deeper problem. The crew's faith in their captain had been tested and found wanting. They had fought bravely, yes, but courage in battle could not erase the growing suspicion that Captain Ash was not the man he claimed to be. Rumors about Quill's disappearance had grown into legends. Some men now said they saw his ghost standing at the rail during the midnight watch, his mouth moving as though trying to speak a warning. Others claimed to hear his voice in the wind, calling Ash's name. The Serpent's Oath limped into Tortuga's harbour under cover of darkness, her hull patched with sailcloth and tar, her crew hollow-eyed and silent. Tortuga was a haven for outlaws, a place where French buccaneers, English privateers, and stateless pirates mingled in taverns and brothels, trading stories of plunder and narrow escapes. The island's governor, a pragmatic Frenchman named d'Ogeron, taxed every transaction and asked no questions about how the gold had been acquired. Ash paid the docking fee in doubloons and ordered his men to begin unloading the treasure. The division of the plunder took place in the same torchlit cavern where Ash had first made his vow of brotherhood. The crew gathered in a circle, watching as Ash and 2 elected quartermasters counted out shares according to the articles. Every man received his portion, including extra shares for the wounded and the families of the dead. It was fair and legal according to pirate custom, but fairness could not silence the whispers. A man named Crane, a veteran sailor with a scar across his throat that made his voice rasp like wind through dead leaves, stepped forward as the last share was distributed. "Captain Ash," he said, and the cavern fell silent. "We have followed you through storm and battle. We have bled for you, and we have killed for you. But there is a question that gnaws at us like weevils in hardtack. What truly happened to Thomas Quill?" Ash met Crane's eyes, seeing in them the collective doubt of every man present. "I told you what happened. He was lost overboard during the night watch." "Aye, you told us. But Quill was no clumsy lubber. He had the surest feet on any deck I've sailed. And there are those who say they saw you speaking with him in the forecastle alone the night he disappeared." The accusation hung in the air like the smoke from the torches. Ash felt the weight of every gaze upon him, felt the secret he had buried threatening to rise from its watery grave. He could lie again, could maintain the fiction and hope it held, or he could speak the truth and trust in the same mercy he had denied Thomas Quill. "Thomas Quill was a traitor," Ash said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I found a letter in his possession, written in cipher, detailing a plan to mutiny and deliver this ship to the Spanish as a privateer. He intended to see me dead and the rest of you enslaved under Spanish articles. I confronted him. He reached for his pistol. I was faster." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of waves against rocks. Crane's expression did not change, but his hand moved to rest on the hilt of his cutlass. Others shifted, their bodies tensing with the possibility of violence. Kwame stood apart from the group, his face unreadable. "You killed him," Crane said, his rasping voice louder now. "You killed one of our brothers and threw him into the sea like offal. You violated the very articles you made us sign." "I protected you from a snake in our midst," Ash replied. "Would you rather I had let him complete his plan? Would you rather be rotting in a Spanish dungeon or dancing from a gibbet in Havana? That was not your choice to make alone." Crane's voice rose, echoing off the cavern walls. "The articles state that accusations of treachery must be brought before the crew, that judgment must be rendered by majority vote, that no man, not even the captain, can execute another without trial." Ash knew Crane was right. The articles were sacred law among pirates, precisely because they prevented tyranny and arbitrary punishment. By killing Quill in secret, Ash had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, he had become the very thing the articles were designed to prevent. A man with absolute power who answered to no authority but his own judgment. "I did what I thought necessary to save this crew," Ash said quietly. "If that makes me guilty under the articles, then judge me as you will." The crew exchanged glances, whispered consultations rippling through the gathering. Some argued for immediate execution, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. Others, mindful of Ash's leadership and the wealth he had brought them, suggested marooning or banishment. Kwame finally spoke, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade through canvas. "Captain Ash stands accused of violating the articles by killing Thomas Quill without trial. But Quill himself stands accused of plotting treachery against this company. We cannot judge one without judging both. I propose we vote on this question. Was Captain Ash justified in his action, given the evidence of Quill's betrayal?" It was a clever gambit, reframing the question to force the crew to weigh Ash's crime against Quill's. The vote was close. 9 men sided with Ash, 7 against him, with Kwame abstaining. By the slimmest of margins, Captain Jeremiah Ash was found justified, but the victory felt hollow. The brotherhood he had proclaimed was broken beyond repair. The trust that bound captain to crew had cracked like a mast under too much sail. Crane spat on the cavern floor. "This vote changes nothing. The articles are dead. Any man who remains aboard the Serpent's Oath sails under a captain who will kill without hesitation and call it justice. I'll not serve such a man." 7 others echoed Crane's sentiment, gathering their shares of the treasure and walking out of the cavern into the Tortuga night. The remaining 9 looked at Ash with expressions ranging from weary acceptance to open suspicion. They would sail with him, but the easy camaraderie of earlier days was gone, replaced by a brittle wariness that would shadow every watch and every order. In the weeks that followed, Captain Ash attempted to rebuild what had been shattered. He led the reduced crew on smaller raids, avoiding the grand ambitions that had led them into conflict with Spanish warships. They took merchant sloops and fishing vessels, accumulating modest plunder that was divided fairly and without dispute. But the heart had gone out of the Serpent's Oath. Men did their duties mechanically, spoke little, and drank heavily in port. When they gathered to sing the old sea shanties, the songs sounded flat and joyless. Kwame remained Ash's most reliable lieutenant, but even he maintained a careful distance. One evening, as they sat in Ash's cabin reviewing charts of the Lesser Antilles, Kwame spoke the truth that neither had dared name. "You saved the crew from Quill's betrayal, but you could not save them from the knowledge of what you did. Men need to believe their captain is somehow better than they are, stronger, wiser, more honorable. You showed them that you are capable of the same ruthless pragmatism that drives any killer. That knowledge is a poison that will never be purged." Ash nodded slowly. "What would you have done in my place? I would have called the crew to assembly, presented the evidence, and let them decide. If Quill was guilty, they would have condemned him. If you were wrong, they would have spared him. Either way, the burden would have been shared, rather than borne alone. And if Quill had talked his way free, if he had convinced them of his innocence?" Kwame smiled sadly. "Then perhaps he would not have been the traitor you believed him to be." The possibility haunted Ash in the nights that followed. What if he had misread the letter? What if Quill's cipher had been innocent, a code meant to protect legitimate correspondence from prying eyes? What if his own fear and suspicion had transformed an ally into an enemy? He could never know, because the only other person who knew the truth lay wrapped in chain at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. 3 months after the confrontation in the cavern, the Serpent's Oath encountered a Dutch merchant ship northeast of Barbados. The vessel was lightly armed and clearly laden with valuable cargo. Ash ordered the approach, raising the black flag to signal their intentions. But as the pirate ship closed the distance, the Dutch captain ran up a white flag of parley and hailed them across the water. "I carry a message for Captain Jeremiah Ash," the Dutch captain shouted, "a letter from Port Royal delivered to me by a man who said it was urgent." Ash allowed the Dutch ship to approach, accepting the sealed letter with cautious suspicion. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, but the seal bore the mark of the Jamaican governor's office. He retreated to his cabin to read it privately. The letter was brief and devastating. Thomas Quill, it stated, had been an agent of the English crown, working undercover to infiltrate pirate crews and identify those who might be turned against Spanish interests. The coded letter Ash had found was indeed a communication with Quill's handler, detailing potential recruits for legitimate privateering commissions. Quill had intended no mutiny, no betrayal. He had been doing exactly what the Crown had commissioned him to do, gathering intelligence to strengthen English naval power in the Caribbean. The governor's letter went on to request information about Quill's fate, noting that he had not reported in months and was feared lost. If Captain Ash had any knowledge of his whereabouts, the letter concluded he would be rewarded for his cooperation and potentially offered a pardon for past offences. Ash read the letter 3 times, each reading driving the knife of guilt deeper into his chest. He had killed an innocent man, or at least a man whose only crime was serving a different master. The treachery he thought he had prevented had existed only in his own fearful imagination. Thomas Quill had died because Captain Jeremiah Ash had been too quick to judge, too ready to believe the worst, too willing to take a life to protect his own authority. He could not tell the crew. If they learned this truth, they would tear him apart, and he would deserve it. But carrying the secret alone was like swallowing stones. It dragged him down, made every breath labored, turned every moment of command into an exercise in hypocrisy. The brotherhood he had proclaimed was built on a foundation of murder and lies, and no amount of fair division of plunder could change that. Captain Ash burned the letter, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flame of his cabin lantern. Then he called Kwame to his cabin and told him everything. About the letter, about Quill's true identity, about the enormity of his mistake. Kwame listened in silence, his expression grave but unsurprised. "What will you do?" Kwame asked when Ash finished speaking. "I don't know. Confess to the crew and face their judgment, sail away and disappear, put a pistol ball through my own skull and end it." "Or you could live with it," Kwame said quietly. "You could carry this weight for the rest of your days, let it shape every decision you make, become the kind of captain who would die before making the same mistake again. That would be a harder penance than any execution." Ash looked at his lieutenant, seeing in those dark eyes a wisdom earned through suffering that Ash was only beginning to understand. "Is that what you would do?" "I have done it," Kwame replied. "Every man who survives slavery carries guilt for those who did not. We live with it or we die from it. That is the only choice we have." The Serpent's Oath continued to sail, but Captain Ash was a changed man. He consulted his crew on every decision, no matter how small. He refused to take more than a single share of plunder, giving his extra portion to the families of dead sailors. He risked his own life to save wounded men during raids, stepping into the line of fire when prudence would have dictated otherwise. Some saw this transformation as weakness. Others recognized it as the actions of a man seeking redemption for a sin he could never confess. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1689, the Serpent's Oath was caught in a hurricane off the coast of Cuba. The storm lasted 3 days, tearing sails to ribbons and snapping the mainmast like kindling. When the skies finally cleared, the ship was half flooded and drifting, her rudder gone, her hull breached in a dozen places. Ash ordered the crew to abandon ship, loading them into the longboats with what provisions remained. He chose to stay behind alone, saying he would pilot the wreck to shore if possible and rejoin them later. Kwame protested, but Ash would not be moved. "Get them to safety," he ordered. "That's a command, not a request." The crew rowed away, watching the Serpent's Oath recede into the distance, her captain standing alone on the tilting deck. They reached the Cuban shore 2 days later, exhausted but alive. They waited a week for Ash to appear, but he never did. Search parties found no trace of the ship or her captain. The sea had claimed both, leaving only questions and the memory of a man who had vowed brotherhood but buried a truth beneath the waves. Years passed. The survivors of the Serpent's Oath scattered across the Caribbean, taking berths on other ships, settling in port towns, or disappearing into the lawless interior of jungle islands. But wherever they went, they carried with them the story of Captain Jeremiah Ash, a tale of loyalty and betrayal, of justice and murder, of a man who tried to lead with honor, but discovered too late that honor demanded more than he had been willing to give. Kwame eventually made his way back to Tortuga, where he opened a tavern near the harbor. Above the bar, he hung a single object, a cutlass with a worn leather grip and the initials J.A. carved into the pommel. He had found it washed up on a beach in Jamaica months after the hurricane, recognizing it immediately as the blade Ash had carried. Salt water had stained the steel, and the leather was cracked, but the weapon remained intact, a silent witness to truths that would never be fully known. Sailors who drank in Kwame's tavern would ask about the cutlass, and Kwame would tell them the story, though he always left out certain details: the letter from Port Royal, the true nature of Quill's mission, the full depth of Ash's guilt. Some truths were too heavy to share, too corrosive to be spoken aloud. Better to let the sea keep its secrets, to let the dead remain dead, to remember Captain Ash not as a murderer, but as a man who tried his best and failed, as all men do in the end. The cutlass hung on that wall for decades, rusting slowly in the salt air, until Kwame himself died and the tavern passed to other hands. The new owners knew nothing of its history and sold it to a collector of maritime curiosities, who sold it to another and another, until its origin was lost entirely. But somewhere in its pitted steel and cracked leather grip, the memory of brotherhood and betrayal remained, waiting for anyone wise enough to read the silent testimony of weathered metal.